23 hours alone. The hidden reality of solitary confinement on death row. 23 hours alone. Before we step inside this story, do one thing. Hit subscribe, tap like, and leave a comment, because what you're about to hear is not just a story, it's a warning. This is one of those cases that doesn't let go once it gets its hands on you. The emergency call came just after 3:17 a.m., when the prison was supposed to be at its quietest. On death row, silence wasn't peace, it was policy. Concrete walls, steel doors, and fluorescent lights humming like they'd never sleep. When the correctional officer reached cell 18, he already knew something was wrong. The observation window was fogged, not with steam, but with breath that shouldn't have been there. Inside, the man on the floor hadn't moved in hours. They said he'd been alone for 23 hours a day. They said isolation was meant to keep everyone safe. But as the medical team stood frozen in the narrow corridor, staring at a body no one had checked on since the night before, one question echoed louder than the alarms. How does someone die when they already locked away from the world? The inmate's name was Daniel Mercer, 42 years old, convicted of a double homicide 15 years earlier, sentenced to death, forgotten long before that morning. His cell measured less than the average parking space, bare concrete, a steel toilet, a slab bolted to the wall they called a bed. No human touch, no conversation, no sound beyond distant footsteps and the occasional scream that guards pretended not to hear. By sunrise, the prison administration had already prepared its statement. Natural causes. Inmate with a history of mental health issues. An unfortunate but unavoidable outcome. The words were clean. Too clean. And that's what caught the attention of someone outside those walls. Investigative journalist Mara Klein had covered prisons before. She knew the language of official lies. When she read the press release, something felt off. Death row inmates were monitored constantly, or so the public was told. Yet Daniel Mercer had died alone, unnoticed, in a system designed to watch everything. Mara requested the incident report, then the medical examiner's preliminary findings, then the surveillance logs. Each request was delayed. Each response arrived incomplete. Timestamps missing. Pages redacted. One document referenced a check that never appeared on camera. That was the first crack in the story. Daniel Mercer hadn't always been silent. According to old court records, he was once articulate, even soft-spoken. He wrote letters in his early years on death row, long, carefully worded pages sent to advocacy groups, journalists, anyone who might listen. Over time, the letters stopped. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was no longer allowed to say it. Solitary confinement wasn't a punishment for his crime. It was a condition of his existence. 23 hours alone. 1 hour in a concrete yard the size of a dog kennel, always alone, always watched. Meals slid through a slot. Medical visits conducted through steel bars. Human contact reduced to commands and compliance. Former guards would later describe death row as a pressure cooker. You don't see men break all at once. One of them told Mara anonymously. You see them crack, piece by piece. First they stop talking. Then they stop eating. Then they stop being anything you'd recognize as human. Mara tracked down Daniel's last known visitor, a prison psychologist named Dr. Alan Reeves. According to logs, Reeves had requested a mental health evaluation just 2 weeks before Daniel's death. The request was marked non-urgent and never completed. When Mara reached Reeves by phone, his voice dropped the moment she mentioned Daniel's name. He hesitated, then said something that made her grip the receiver tighter. I warned them, he said. I told them keeping him in isolation that long was dangerous. Dangerous how? Mara asked. Not just to him, Reeves replied. To everyone. Inside the prison, rumors were already spreading. Guards whispered about Daniel screaming through the night days before he died. Inmates claimed they heard him banging on the door, begging for help that never came. Officially, none of it happened. Unofficially, it was an open secret. Mara's next break came from an unexpected source, a former death row inmate whose sentence had been overturned years earlier. His name was Lucas Hale, and he'd spent nearly a decade in solitary confinement before walking free. 23 hours alone changes how your brain works, Lucas told her. You start hearing things, seeing patterns that aren't there. And when you finally do break, no one believes you, because the system already decided you're insane. Lucas remembered Daniel. Not as a face. No one saw faces in solitary, but as a voice. A voice that used to whisper through the vents late at night, asking simple questions. What day is it? Is anyone still out there? Am I still alive? The night Daniel died, Lucas said. The voice stopped. Mara published her first article within days. She didn't accuse anyone outright. She didn't need to. She laid out the facts, the timeline gaps, the ignored warnings, the silence that surrounded Daniel Mercer's final hours. The response was immediate. Advocates demanded answers. The prison announced an internal review. Politicians promised transparency. And behind closed doors, documents began to move, quietly, urgently. A source slid an envelope across a cafe table to Mara 3 nights later. Inside were photocopies of internal emails stamped confidential. Messages between senior staff. One line stood out, underlined in red ink. Do not log additional checks. Minimize exposure. Minimize exposure to what? As Mara read deeper, her stomach tightened. The emails weren't about Daniel's mental health. They weren't about safety. They were about precedent. About what would happen if the public learned how many death row inmates were deteriorating in isolation and how many had already died. The final page was a scan of a maintenance request filed the night Daniel Mercer collapsed. It reported a malfunctioning camera outside cell 18. The timestamp matched the hours when no checks were recorded. Someone had been watching. Someone had chosen not to record it. And when Mara realized that Daniel Mercer wasn't the first inmate to die under these exact circumstances, but merely the most recent, she understood the truth was far bigger than one cell, one man, or one prison. Because if the system could erase Daniel Mercer without consequence, it could erase anyone. But the most chilling detail wasn't in the emails or the logs. It was a handwritten note attached to the file, likely never meant to leave the prison. 3 words, scrawled in ink. He knew too much. And when Mara traced what Daniel Mercer had been trying to expose in the weeks before his death, she discovered a secret buried deep inside death row, one that would put her directly in the crosshairs next. Because opening that door wouldn't just reveal how Daniel died. It would reveal why they were so afraid to let him live. The first official report labeled the death as natural causes complicated by pre-existing conditions. It was signed, stamped, and archived within 48 hours. But inside the concrete maze of the death row unit, nothing about the situation felt natural. The cell where Marcus Hale had spent his final years was stripped bare within hours of his body being removed. Guards scrubbed the walls, replaced the mattress, and swapped out the steel toilet, as if erasing him might erase the questions too. Only one thing remained untouched: the thin crack running down the corner of the wall, a fracture Marcus had once traced with his fingernail every day to count time. It was still there when Internal Affairs finally arrived. Detective Laura Mendez stood in the doorway of the cell, breathing in the cold, metallic air. She had investigated homicides, cartel executions, and police corruption cases, but this place unsettled her in a different way. Solitary confinement wasn't loud or chaotic. It was quiet, too quiet, a silence that pressed down on the chest and made thoughts echo longer than they should. Marcus Hale had been alone for 23 hours a day, for 11 years. According to medical logs, he had complained of chest pain, hallucinations, and insomnia. According to staff reports, he was uncooperative and exaggerating symptoms. According to surveillance footage, the camera covering his tear went offline for exactly 37 minutes the night he died. That last detail wasn't in the official report. Mendez learned about it from an anonymous email sent at 3:12 a.m. The subject line read, "You're looking in the wrong direction." Attached was a still image pulled from internal footage. Marcus standing at his cell door, pounding weakly, his mouth open in what looked like a scream. The timestamp cut off mid-frame. When Mendez asked the prison's IT supervisor about the missing footage, he claimed it was a routine outage. When she asked why no maintenance ticket existed, he stopped making eye contact. When she asked who had access to the surveillance controls that night, his answer came too fast. Only supervisors. The investigation began to widen, and with it came resistance. Requests for documents were delayed. Interviews were rescheduled. Guards suddenly remembered conversations differently. Medical staff closed ranks, citing privacy laws. It became clear that Marcus Hale wasn't just an inmate who had died. He was a liability. The deeper Mendez dug, the more patterns emerged. Marcus wasn't the first death row inmate to die alone in a cell under questionable circumstances. Over the past decade, 6 others had died while in long-term solitary confinement. Heart failure, stroke, suicide. all ruled unavoidable, all occurring within facilities that shared the same administrative oversight, and all preceded by complaints that mirrored Marcus's almost word for word. One former corrections officer, now living 2 states away under a different last name, finally agreed to speak. He chose a roadside diner, sitting with his back to the wall, voice low. "They break people in there," he said. "Not with fists. With time." He described the special housing unit as a pressure chamber. Lights that never fully went off. Meals slid through slots without a word. Recreation cages barely larger than the cells themselves. Medical requests that disappeared into a void. "If someone starts losing it," he continued, "he becomes a problem. Problems get managed." When Mendez asked what managed meant, the man stared into his coffee. "Sometimes it means ignoring them until their body gives out." As the interview ended, the man leaned forward, lowering his voice even further. "You should know something else. Marcus wasn't supposed to be on death row anymore." That statement cracked the case wide open. Court records revealed that months before his death, new DNA evidence had surfaced in Marcus Hale's case, evidence that cast serious doubt on his conviction. His attorney had filed a motion for a new hearing. The paperwork had been received by the prison administration, but Marcus had never been informed. In fact, internal emails showed that the warden's office had discussed the motion privately, expressing concern about operational disruption if Marcus were removed from death row. One email ended with a line that chilled Mendez to the bone. "Delay until resolved." Resolved how? The pressure on Mendez intensified. She noticed the same black sedan parked outside her apartment 3 nights in a row. Her phone began glitching during calls. A superior pulled her aside and suggested she narrow the scope of her inquiry. Then, another inmate died. This one didn't make the news. Elliot Crane, 46, had been held in solitary confinement for 9 years. He was found unresponsive during morning count, seated upright on his bunk, eyes open. The official cause was suicide, though no ligature was found. No note. No history of self-harm. When Mendez reviewed the logs, she saw that Crane had filed multiple requests to speak with her office in the weeks before his death. All were marked forwarded. None were answered. Security footage from Crane's tears showed the same 37-minute gap. The same gap as Marcus Hale. Now it was impossible to ignore. Someone was controlling when the cameras went dark. Someone with authority. Someone who understood the system well enough to exploit it quietly. Mendez confronted the warden directly. He listened patiently, hands folded, expression calm. "Detective," he said, "you're seeing patterns where there are none. These men were dangerous criminals." Marcus Hale was days away from a potential exoneration, Mendez replied. "And now he's dead." The warden's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Solitary confinement doesn't kill people," he said. "Their choices do." That night, Mendez returned to her office to find a sealed envelope on her desk. No return address. Inside was a single flash drive and a handwritten note. "If you keep going, they'll bury this too." The flash drive contained raw surveillance footage, unedited, unlogged. It showed the interior of Marcus Hale's cell during the outage. Marcus on the floor, breathing shallow, reaching toward the door. A guard passing by, pausing, then walking away.
Until the second figure stepping into frame.
And then, a second figure stepping into frame. Not a guard, a supervisor. As the figure leaned toward the cell door, the video cut to black. Mendez sat back in her chair, heart pounding. This wasn't neglect anymore. This was something else entirely. And if the footage was real, Marcus Hale hadn't just been left to die. He had been watched.
The fallout came faster than Mendez expected, and slower than justice deserved. Within hours of securing the footage, she duplicated it and sent encrypted copies to 3 separate oversight bodies. She also sent one to a journalist she trusted, a woman who had spent years exposing abuse inside closed institutions. If the system tried to bury this, it would have to bury it everywhere. By morning, the prison went into lockdown. Officially, it was a security drill. Unofficially, it was panic. Guards were pulled from posts and reassigned without explanation. Supervisors avoided eye contact. The warden canceled all non-essential meetings and stopped answering calls. Somewhere inside the concrete and steel, people were deciding what could still be controlled and what could not. Mendez was escorted off prison grounds before noon. "You're no longer authorized on-site," a deputy told her, voice rehearsed. "Internal affairs will handle it from here." That was the moment she knew she was close. The media story broke that evening. It didn't lead with Marcus Hale's name. It led with the footage. A blurred still frame dominated the screen. A man collapsed on a concrete floor, an outstretched hand frozen inches from a steel door. The headline read, "Death row inmate died while supervised." Footage raises questions. Within minutes, the story exploded. Former inmates came forward. Families of the dead started calling. Civil rights groups demanded emergency hearings. Politicians issued carefully worded statements that said nothing while implying concern. The prison department released a denial, then a revision, then silence. But the footage kept playing. Frame by frame, analysts slowed it down, enhanced it, identified the figure in the doorway. It was Deputy Warden Richard Kessler. Kessler had been with the department for 22 years. He was known as a fixer, the man sent in when facilities needed to be stabilized. His record was clean, too clean. Promotions without controversy. No complaints that stuck. Until now, Mendez was called to testify before a federal review panel 48 hours later. She laid everything out: the surveillance gaps, the ignored medical requests, the delayed legal motions, the pattern of deaths tied to solitary confinement, and finally, the footage. When the panel asked her what she believed had happened to Marcus Hale, she didn't hesitate. He was left to die, she said, and it wasn't an accident. It was a decision. The panel went silent. Kessler was arrested the next morning. His attorney claimed the footage was misleading, taken out of context, that Kessler had been instructed not to intervene due to protocol. But when pressed to produce the protocol, none could be found. When asked why the cameras went offline, no one could explain how outages aligned so perfectly with inmate deaths. Then the email surfaced. Internal correspondence showed Kessler advocating for administrative delays in cases where inmates had pending appeals. He framed it as risk management, as avoiding operational complications. In one message sent weeks before Marcus Hale's death, he wrote, "If he leaves the unit, everything changes." Marcus Hale was exonerated posthumously. The DNA evidence cleared him completely. The conviction was vacated. The state issued an apology to his family, a sterile document that could never reach the man who had spent 11 years alone, counting cracks in a wall. His sister stood at a press conference, holding a photograph of Marcus taken before his arrest. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't shake. "They killed my brother slowly," she said, "and they called it policy." The investigation widened again. Facilities across the country were audited. Solitary confinement practices came under scrutiny. Some units were shut down, others quietly renamed. Official reforms were announced, time limits imposed, oversight committees formed. But behind the headlines, the truth was more complicated. Kessler wasn't alone. Testimony revealed that multiple supervisors knew about the surveillance gaps. Medical staff admitted they were discouraged from escalating complaints. Guards confessed, off the record, that ignoring inmates in solitary was normalized. After a while, one said, "You stop seeing them as people, you just see doors." Kessler took a plea deal. He admitted to dereliction of duty, but denied intent. He would serve time, though far less than Marcus Hale ever did. He never explained why he stood outside that cell, never said what he was thinking as he turned away. Some questions remained unanswered. Why that night? Why Marcus? Why the others? Mendez returned to her office months later. The case officially closed. On her desk sat a final report, hundreds of pages thick. It documented failures, reforms, and recommendations. It would be cited in law journals, quoted in hearings, filed away. Late one evening, as she packed up to leave, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. The message contained a single line. They fixed the cameras. But they didn't fix the silence. Mendez stared at the screen, the weight of it settling in. Solitary confinement was still being used. Death row was still full. And somewhere, someone was still spending 23 hours a day alone, waiting to be heard. The system had punished a man after proving he was innocent. It had apologized after he was dead, and had promised change after it was forced to. The lights in Mendez's office flickered as she turned them off, the hum echoing down the empty hallway. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of how close justice had come to disappearing into concrete walls and locked doors. Marcus Hale's name would be remembered now, not as a number, not as a body in a cell, but as proof of what happens when silence becomes policy. And if this story disturbed you, if it made you uncomfortable, that means it mattered, because there are still doors we don't open, still cameras we don't check, still people waiting in the dark. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe, like, and share this story, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The shadows only disappear when people keep watching.